Andrea is our next presenter. She's been working for a number of years as a pesticide compliance and enforcement officer in Calgary. She's going to talk about MRLs, and I will pass it over to you so you can go ahead and set up your presentation.
Thanks, Jamie.
We see it.
Just give me a second here. Now, can everyone can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Perfect. All right, I will start. I found this lovely pointer so I can highlight what I talk about. Kind of cool. So I'm going to talk about MRLs. That's maximum residue limits. That is kind of ties with the first two presentations we had with the resistance, and then we had with the water quality. So this ties in a way because it's all about pesticides. So this is who I am. You can see me, I can't see you because I all I can see is my presentation and I can see Jamie. That's all I can see. So I'm with the Pesticides Compliance Program of Health Canada. We used to be part of the PMRA. Now the PMRA is separate from us, but we still work together with them. So today, I've got a fairly in-detail presentation. So I'm going to talk about the definitions of the maximum residue limits. I'll talk about how they're set up and the trials of crop trials, kind of give an example of some of those, how the MRLs will affect the dietary exposure, risk assessments, how that's all done. And then there's differences in MRLs and why they are. And if there's time, I'm going to put a little international flavor into this, and I'm going to talk about the Codex. So there's a Codex Alimentarius Commission and the Codex Committee on Pesticide Residue. So that's the international flavor. So if I have time, great. If not, we're more concerned about Canada, so we'll just stick to the Canadian portion of this. So what I'm going to start with is the definitions. So maximum residue levels, they're defined slightly different amongst different regulatory bodies. So if you look at the European Commission, which is like basically the European Union, how they define a maximum residue level is it's the highest level of a pesticide residue that is legally tolerated in or on food or feed when pesticides are applied correctly. Okay, that makes sense. Now, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, they don't call it a maximum residue limit. They'll call it a tolerance. So they set tolerances, which are the maximum amount of pesticide allowed to remain in or on food as part of the process of regulating pesticides. So here they're saying in some countries, tolerances are called maximum residue limits. Now, if you go to Australia and New Zealand, right, the maximum residue limit is the highest amount of an agricultural or veterinary chemical residue that's legally allowed in a food product sold in Australia, New Zealand, whether it is produced domestically or imported. So as you can see from these definitions, other countries outside of Canada, they set their own MRLs or maximum residue levels. And the important thing to note here is that when we produce food in Canada and we export it to another country, the food that we export has to comply with the importing country's maximum residue levels, as is when they import or export to us, or we export from them, same thing, they have to recognize ours and abide by ours. So before we ship any products to other countries, we need to know what their what residues are allowed, like pesticide residues are allowed in their countries, right? So, because if we if we export product to another country and they will test, as do we, and our maximum residue levels of their limits, I guess, if we exceed their limits, that could have trade barriers. They could they could shut the border, right? So they say no more wheat from Canada, you've exceeded it, we will not accept it, we'll try again in say 7 years. So they have the rights to do that, as does Canada. So that's just an FYI. That's why this is so important. So you have the 3 different countries now here. Like, how does Canada define the maximum residue level or limit? So, oops. So in Canada, it's a fairly longer, statement. As part of the assessment process prior to the registration of a pesticide, Health Canada must determine whether the consumption of the maximum amount of residues that are expected to remain on food when a pesticide is used according to label directions will not be of concern to human health. This maximum amount of residues expected is legally established as a maximum residue limit and is regulated under the Pest Control Products Act of Health Canada. So if you note my slides, I'll have little links in the bottom. If you want to know more, just, take a look at those links so you can take a picture and you can read a lot more, because there's a lot of information on this. I just kind of picked and chose the highlights basically. So you look at maximum residue limits, they are under the authority of the Food and Drugs Act and regulations, which says Health Canada sets the MRLs of chemicals in food products and establishes the maximum allowable level of contamination for environmental and industrial pollutants. So that's important to know, is that Health Canada does set the MRLs. Now, each maximum residue limit, another important fact here, is set for a specific pesticide. So each pesticide has their own MRL with the food type that they're being applied on. So wheat would have a potentially different MRL than, say, barley, potentially, or canola with a certain pesticide. Now, when they're looking at these maximum residue limits, they're looking at the Canadians' geography, right? We have a unique climate, you have geography, topography, like from east to west, our climate's not the same. We have a very extensive, we have huge differences. And when they look at the MRLs, or maximum residue limits, they look at all the food types. So you have the vegetables, the meats, the dairies, the grains, processed foods are all included in the maximum residue limits. And they're set for each pesticide crop combination. These limits are set there. This is also important to note. They are well below the amount that could pose a health concern to any person eating the food. This includes, the babies, the elderly, everyone. So they look at the human population as a whole in Canada and says, okay, at what level will the residues that potentially could be on the crop / the food you're eating, at what level will it cause no harm or very little, be considered so-called safe? So usually a maximum residue limit is set for what we call a raw agricultural food commodity, as well as a processed food that comes from the agricultural food commodity. So you have the raw ingredient, and then it could be processed into something else or other things. Sometimes, however, and I'll go into this a bit later on, sometimes the processed food might require a higher maximum residue limit than the raw agricultural commodity. And I'll have some slides on that later on. So, but if, and this is another point, if it is determined that an unacceptable risk exists, then the product will not be prepared for sale or use in Canada. So when a product is being registered in Canada, this is also one of the criteria for being registered in Canada. It has to have a maximum residue limit that will be considered safe or within safe limits for the Canadians to ingest that food. So I'm going to go to poll number 1. Jamie, if you can pull it up. And I can't see, so if it's up, I can't see it.
It is up. It is in the chat. So she's just looking for maximum, or the MRL. What does it stand for? So.
You got 5 choices. And Jamie, if you could let me know what the results are, because I'm scared if I get out of this, my presentation mode, I'll lose everything.
No worries. Almost everybody is picking maximum residue limit.
Good, then I repeated myself often enough. What they say, right? You repeat yourself 3 to 7 times, and it gets ingrained in your mind. So yes, it is a maximum residue limit is what it is. So yep, answer C is the correct one. So when a pesticide, and everyone knows this, when a pesticide is applied to crops, there is a likelihood that there'll be residues left on the crop and other surfaces around the crop, whether it's a crop, the ground, fence line, whatever it is, the residues may still stay around or stick around. Now, the length of time that there's a hazard caused by the residue varies widely between the product, and it's influenced by rate and crop species. So when it breaks down, right, the type of pesticide used, some break down more readily than others. Some are residual. They'll stick around for years, months, depending on the time frame. The application conditions. UV is a great breaker, is great for breaking down pesticides, and the type of food treated. So if you have a crop that has, as the crop grows, there's more leafy material, then the pesticide in or on the plant will reduce as there's more vegetation. Now, to protect farm workers, anyone who's working in agriculture or horticulture or greenhouses, to protect farm workers or any kind of applicator from exposure to pesticide residues, the pesticide label indicates a re-entry time for each crop. And these also could be very specific to activities. So workers, basically, they should not re-enter the crop without the protective clothing until the re-entry time has elapsed. So if there's a re-entry interval of 12 hours, if for some reason you need to go in before the 12 hours, you need to be fully PPE, just like the label says when you were sprayed, you got to get fully PPE before you go in. After the 12 hours, at that point, the residual should not be transmitted or dislodgeable. It won't come off. So at that point, it is safe to go back in. So if it's 12 hours, 2 days, 2 hours, right? Whatever the restricted entry interval is, you must abide by that if you want to keep the pesticides off of yourself. So after a pesticide is applied, as I said before, small amounts or trace amounts of pesticides will or could stay on the food. So pesticides that are intended for use on food crops must be tested for safety of these residues. So that's when the PMRA says, okay, you want to register a product. These are the information we need. These are the scientific data we need you to send to us so we can analyze what the residues limits will be and if they're going to be acceptable. As a part of this assessment process, before a pesticide can be used on a food product, then Health Canada scientists that are all in Ottawa, mostly now, they have to study whether the pesticide residues that may be found in or on a food will be of concern to the human health and determine the safe levels of residue. So we know when you use a pesticide, it's there for a reason. You want to control a pest. Now the PMRA comes along and says, okay, great, you want to control the pest. We have to make sure when you use something to control a pest that when we, the humans, Canadians, consume it, it's safe for us to consume. And that's what we call the maximum residue limits, or the MRLs. That's where they come into play. So basically, when you look at Canadian MRLs, right, they are legally established as the highest amount of allowable residue for foodstuff in Canada. It's important to remember, they are set at levels far, far below the amount of pesticide residues that could cause health concern. This, like I mentioned before, they take into account all the populations, including the young, the middle-aged, the pregnant, the adolescents, you name it, they're all taken into account. And they're set for all foods sold in Canada, whether they're produced locally or they're imported. So it's important to know that it's imported, and that's where the international portion comes later on. What's imported also is the residues, if there are residues, have to meet our MRLs. And they apply to fruits, vegetables, meats, dairy products, grains, basically anything that a pesticide will or could be applied to that we will end up eating or eating either primarily or secondary, it all has an MRL. And this is important to note that if there's no specific maximum residue limit for a pesticide crop combination or group, the residue, there's like a default or general MRL, and that is 0.1 parts per million. So I'll show you later on, there's a place where you can look for all the different MRLs. We have a listing on our website. Our website's awesome. You can find anything you want in there if you look hard enough. Now, if you're looking for a crop, you're looking for a pesticide combination and it's not there, then it's 0.1, right? So basically, setting the MRLs, what we're doing with this is you're protecting health and the environment. So before setting an MRL for a given pesticide on a food in before you set an MRL for a given pesticide on food, Health Canada scientists, again, these are in Ottawa, they evaluate the pesticides to ensure that it can be used in a way that protects human health and the environment and effectively manages pests. So it's like a three-part, it's like a triad they're looking at. When they look at these and they're looking at the exposures of the MRLs to Canadians. They examine the amount of a given pesticide residue you might be exposed to when you are consuming food. So this potential exposure looks at all the foods you might eat in a typical day, the variety of foods you might eat over your lifetime. So it's not just a snapshot of now. It's like, okay, do I eat 1 apple today, 1 apple tomorrow? What if I eat 10 apples today, 10 apples tomorrow, right? So we look at the exposure, like the potential for exposure for consuming these residues. And then there's also international guidelines. So the international community works together and they set MRLs in line. So it's like a big scientific group. And they use MRLs so to make sure it's a doable MRL. Like it has to be keep humans safe, but it has to be a doable. It has to be it has to still contain it has to control the pest, but it also has to be safe for humans. So it's a fine line between too much and not enough either way. And it's important to note too that over time MRLs can change based on how the pesticides are used and growing conditions might change. So, is it safe to eat foods treated with pesticides? Well, they are regulated. So we do watch over them. And we keep, like he always says, they're established, they're science-based MRLs, right? So there's a lot of science behind the final decisions. So the MRLs, they help ensure that pesticides are being used properly by growers and they provide Canadians with access to a safe food supply, right? So that's what MRLs will do. It also ensures that the Canadian MRLs are respected domestically within Canada and internationally outside of Canada. So all foods that the Canadians would eat or could eat in Canadian or in Canadian soils are following our MRLs, our maximum residue limits. Imported foods also have to meet our limits. No matter what their limits are in their country, it has to meet our limits, and they're expected. These food types are inspected at the point of entry into Canada. So and this is another thing, if you follow label directions, and of course everyone does, right? If the label directions are followed, then the pesticide residues will not exceed the MRLs. So it's important if you over apply, MRLs are your MRLs or your maximum residue limits that remain may change or may be different. So the application rates, the timing on the pesticide label is carefully calculated by our scientists through research so that residues be less than the MRL when crops are harvested or animals are slaughtered. MRLs are used to check if pesticides are being used properly. So this is also, regulators will go outside, will take samples, not necessarily me, will take samples, and they will look for the residue levels to make sure they're not exceeding what the Canadians or what's allowed in Canada. So he'll give you an example here. So when we talk about the food you eat and the MRLs, how it might affect you, okay? You'd have to eat about 280 apples every day for your whole life for there to be a health concern related to the pesticide residues sprayed on apple trees. And 280 apples, to give yourself a visual of 280 apples, that's like filling up a shopping cart. So if you were to eat that many apples every day for your whole lifetime, then you may have an issue with the residues on those apples. So you can see how far down the MRLs are set. As far as safety factor, it's quite far down. Now, what happens if food that's tested, whether it's imported or grown in Canada, what happens if the food tested is and exceeds the limits of the MRLs? So if you remember in the couple previous slides, I mentioned that Health Canada is the department that sets the MRLs under the Food and Drugs Act. Now the CFIA, or the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, they're the federal department that enforces the regulations of MRLs. So the Health Canada sets the MRLs. It's the CFIA, they sample products or sample foods for MRLs. So they sample foods for chemical residues and pesticide residues. And if the tested food does exceed the limits, then enforce these, you see on the bullets on the slide that those are the enforcement actions that could take place, right? They can remove food from stores, you can seize supplies of food, you can stop the imports at the border, and you can prosecute offenders. So this is just a very simple snapshot of some of the enforcement actions that could be taken if MRLs are exceeding the amount allowable in Canada. So this helps the government determine whether the pesticides are being used correctly in Canada. It's one of the ways to check that farmers and growers are using labels or following label directions. So the CFI, if you see a government inspector outside taking samples of crops, it could be the CFIA, it could be Health Canada. If it's a CFIA taking a sample, say you're in a strawberry patch and they're taking samples of the edible portion of the strawberry, because they're looking for, if you're going to eat a strawberry, how much residue is on there. If right beside the CFIA inspector is a Health Canada inspector, we can be working side by side. They are taking the sample of the strawberries. We, Health Canada, coming along and taking a sample of the leaves. So we're not checking for MRLs, we're checking for unregistered products. So we could be both out there sampling the same product or same crop, but we're looking for different things. So one, Health Canada, we look for unregistered products. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency, they're looking for products exceeding MRLs. So why we said MRLs, it's pretty much a given, right? To make sure the food we eat is safe. So that when you go to the grocery store and you buy yourself your food, you don't have to worry about, okay, am I gonna get sick if I eat this apple? How about this cheese, right? So that's why MRLs are set. It's like a control. And if you look at a pesticide, before a pesticide gets registered in Canada, right, it has to go through a whole bunch of the registrants or companies that manufacture these pesticides. They have to send all the scientific data to Health Canada. The scientists in Ottawa, they review all this data. One of the data sets they review are the MRLs that are set for that pesticide and the crop combination. So if the health and environmental risks are not acceptable, if there is reasonable certainty that there could be harm to human health in the future generations or the environment, if either one of those is a yes, then the product or the pesticide will likely not be registered or continue to be registered in Canada. So, right, health and environmental risk have to be acceptable. There has to be reasonable certainty that no harm will come if you eat food that is on the grocery shelf. And that is why the PMRA sets, or the Health Canada sets, these science-based maximum residue limits, right? Make sure that we are safe with what we eat. Now, this gives you a little bit of an understanding of the importance of the MRLs. So now we're going to talk about a bit more about how the MRLs are, how they're determined, this is not what I do. This is what Ottawa would do. Like, I'm a regulations officer, so I do regulatory stuff. So this is, if you want more information on this, best thing to do is check my little links in the bottom and you can read more. So for the residue chemistry crop groups, so this is to facilitate the establishment of the maximum residue limits. Health Canada's Pest Management Regulatory Agency uses crop groups. These are individual groups. So individual crops are allocated to a crop group. And you see that on the right-hand side on this page, and there's all these numbers there, right? So these crop groups are based on botanical and taxonomic criteria, as well as the cultivation practices within the region. So crop groups simplify the establishment of MRLs, because if they have to do an MRL for every single crop, you can see how time consuming that will be. So they're looking at crop groupings to make it simpler. So it's by simplifying the MRLs, like they can use the residue data for crops that are representative of the whole group, right? So crop groups can also contain smaller or mostly closely related groups or subgroups. So you have the major groups and you can have subgroups underneath that, or subcrops, right? The residue chemistry crop groups used by the PMRA are listed on this. It's called the Updated Residue Chemistry Guideline. It's a document within our Health Canada website. Now, if you click on the bottom there, the link there, that's when you click, if you take a picture of it, that will take you to it. Now, these crop groups, they contain about 500 crops. And we work with the United States Environmental Protection Agency, so they kind of work together with the United States. If you look, for example, where is it? Crop group number 1 up here, right? You see roots and tubers. So these vegetables are represented, like the represented commodities in group 1. Say you were to like what's in group 1, you'll find there's carrots, potatoes, radishes, sugar beets, sweet potatoes, and crops like that. Now we swing down here to group 15. These are your cereal grains. The represented commodities here are corn, fresh sweet corn or dried field corn, barley, wheat, rye, oats, buckwheat, and crops like that. So you can see how the crop groupings work here. There's 26 different crop groupings on this page. And so when you click on those links there, it'll give you more an example of what you can find in there. So the last slide is a quite busy slide. So thought I'd maybe just kind of summarize it a bit. So Health Canada sets MRLs for crop groups as well as for individual crops. A crop group is a group of plants or crops that are categorized based on their function, the plant structure, how the crop is grown, and of course, the botanical and taxonomic criteria. And this is important too, within a crop group, there is a representative crop or crops are identified. This representative group is often the biggest or most important crop produced or eaten, has residue levels that will generally be representative of the crops within the crop group. So instead of testing every single crop in a crop group, they will take a representative crop or crops. For example, if we go back to, back to 8 over here, right? Go to 8. What do we say here? 8 is fruiting vegetables. So the representative crop for that crop grouping would be the tomato. The tomatoes are highly, well, they're big crop in that crop group. So when I mentioned this came from the updated residue chemistry guidelines, this is what the guideline looks like. It was published back in 2022, so it's not a very old document. As far as Health Canada standards go, this is a fairly new document. So before a registrant registers a product in Canada, they have to go to, or they're requested, well, I guess they have to go to this guideline, this document, right? And they use this document when they're preparing, conducting, and reporting experimental studies to address residue chemistry data requirements, because those requirements are needed in order to set MRLs. The data that they generate will explain the nature and the quantity of residues in treated foods for purposes of dietary risks assessments and for setting the MRLs. And to help with this, and this starts getting a little more complicated. To help with this, you got crop groupings. So you got like a whole bunch of crops organized into nice, neat little categories. So that's great. So now we can find MRLs for different crop groupings, but now we have to look at where the crops are grown, because how they're grown also affects the MRLs. So this is when they adopt a common zone map. So this is done by, because we're North America. So basically US and US Environmental Protection Agency and the PMRA, we have a map. And this is what they use this is the map they use when they do field trial residue data, because data within, and I'll show you the picture here. If you look in here, these are all the little map zones. So we look in each of these zones. Anything that's tested into one of these colors will work for every single grouping, every single product in that group. So each of these regions on this map here, they're recognized by their physical characteristics, such as the soils, the crops, the climate that makes the region unique. And we're looking at the Canadian part. So let's just take a line right here. Here's Canada, right? So we look at the Canadian, you can see how much agricultural land we have versus the States. Like we have a lot of white. So the agricultural land is what's being colored. These regions here are used for experimental studies in support of residue chemistry data requirements for the registration of a new pesticide. And as you can see, it's been harmonized between the United States and Canada. So we look at these ones here. So you look at Alberta, we're right here, right? You can see this big old pink line, all the pink stuff here that goes all the way across into the prairies. So this is this is zone 14. This is the northern prairie. So samples or tests are done, field trials done in these areas can be used for all of these areas. So all crops grown in these areas are, if they're in the pink, then if I grow a crop right here and take this and do a study, it'll be equal to the crop down here, give or take. You know, it's not 100%. If you look at the red zone goes right down into the states here. This is a dry land prairie area. So you can see it covers a lot of, it's part of Alberta, a bit of Saskatchewan, and quite a bit in the states. Now you go to gray, this gray area here, that's called the Rocky Mountains. That's zone 9, that's the Rocky Mountain zone. Now if you look here underneath the red, this one to highlight, this little peachy spot right there. Okay, that is it's called zone 7A. So zone 7, if you remember, that's the dry land prairie. 7A, it's different because irrigation is used here. So it is a dry land prairie, but they use irrigation. So because we're using irrigation, the crops grown, the way they grow it differs. So they gave it its own classification on this the map zone. So this next slide here, if you look at this, okay, so field trials, okay, they're basically supervised trials. So they're done so that the scientists are looking for some information. So they put a trial out there for a specific reason, for a specific crop, a specific pesticide, a specific weed, right? And so they want to analyze, A, does the pesticide used, does it kill the weed? B, what's residues are left behind? C, when the crop is harvested, what's residues are left? So that's what they look for in the field trials. So I'll leave it at that because this is, well, this one little part down here. This is where you get a little bit into the international part. Once they get, there's there's little calculators. The OECD, this is the Organization of Economical Cooperation and Development. This is basically the European Union. They put out a calculator. So when other countries like Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, if you come up with a number, you can pop it into the calculator. This calculator will then generate the MRL within a 95th percentile. So it is a very good tool. And the good tool thing about this too is like it's an international tool that has been developed for everyone to use. So that's just a little tiny blip into the international portion, but I'll come back to that later. So when you look at crop field trials, you want to set these MRLs, right? And they have to be legitimate. They have to be real time. So field trials, they try to account for the variability in results among field trials. So like field trial A, if that's all you have is one field trial, you get results. How meaningful is one result? So if they have field 2, 3, 4, 5, now you're getting more sites. Now you have more of there's a bigger range to take from. So you use more than one test site so you can check for variabilities. Because it might be in a dryland area, but if you get a lot of rain this one year, it might skew the results. So when they take all these test sites, more than one test site, they measure the combined effects, right? The soil types, the weather, regional cultural practices, all that's looked in together at these different crop trial sites, which is why they do more than one. So there might be local drainage might be different. The mixing and spraying of pesticides might be different. They might have different, equipment that they use. If you're in the prairies, you use bigger machines. Out east, you might use smaller machines, for putting out the chemicals. So it could change how things are worked. So crop field trials, they try and do more than one. And basically it's one season is all they really need if they have more than one trial done in one location. So now CFIA, that's Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and Health Canada and MRL. So how do we all fit together? I mentioned this before. Health Canada, important to know, Health Canada sets the MRLs, but we don't test for them. So we set them. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency, they test them. So they test for chemical residues and they test for contaminants. And basically the CFIA, when they test foods, they test about 15,000 samples. So they do about 15,000 samples every year on imported and domestic foods. So when they're testing them, if they test, say they're in your field and they're testing your crop, and they say, okay, well, the tests come back above the established MRL. They say, okay, well, these limits came back higher than they're supposed to be. So then they will talk to the Health Canada saying, hey, these results are higher. What's our next step, basically? So then Health Canada will look at the risk assessment outcome from that pesticide and the crop, and they'll discuss with the CFIA. So the CFIA can make a final decision on whether they need to take further action, like to seize product, recall product, right? Or if it's necessary. So if you look at it this way, just think about this as like a traffic light. So when levels of residues or contaminants exceed the limits, the traffic light goes from green to yellow. This means caution, and we need to look at further assessments, right? And that's when you talk to Health Canada. Okay, we're at yellow. Like, what do we do? And the assessment here determines that the food is unsafe, that goes up to red, or safe goes down to green. And the only reason they can do that is because the limits are set far, far below the amount that could pose a health concern. So that's why they have this wiggle space. Now, poll number 2. Jamie, if you can pop it up, please. Again, I can't see it. So this one is who sets MRLs and who tests for the MRLs. And Jamie, if you can let me know what the results are.
Yeah, so for those of you that can see the poll either in the chat or popped up, the options for those of you that can't, Health Canada for both, CFIA for both, Health Canada sets, CFIA tests, CFIA sets, Health Canada tests, or none of the above. And results are coming in. And the majority, 86% are saying Health Canada sets, CFIA tests.
Excellent. Awesome. Perfect. Thank you. All right, now moving on. MRLs and foods. So MRLs are set, like I've mentioned over and over again, MRLs are set for each pesticide crop combination. And again, they're set, and that's why I keep repeating this. It's very important to know that they're set at levels well below the amount that could pose a health concern. So an MRL applies to, like we talked about, the raw agricultural food, as well as a processed food that contains it. So now that to note here, though, sometimes, and I'll talk about this a little bit later on again, still more, the processed food might require a higher MRL than the food it came from. So in this case, there'll be a separate MRL, one for the raw food and one for the processed food. So it's only going to have a higher MRL if it is determined that an unacceptable risk has been identified. So if there is unacceptable risk, the product will not be permitted for sale in Canada. So this includes the pesticide and the food crop. So if you're using a pesticide and you can't keep it within the MRLs, then the pesticide will not be registered in Canada or will be taken off the market in Canada. Same goes for the food. If the food is not safe to consume because of the residue limits, then they also will be taken out of the marketplace. So, and this is like a repeat from the slide before, right? Now let's talk about the MRL database. Like, this is super cool stuff. So here's, like, if you go to into our website, it's an online inquiry, right? So it's a place you can search. It's actually quite, I looked at it the other day, it's quite easy to do. So if you look at it, right, you have the search buttons right here, and then you can type in here for, like, a search. So you can ask, for example, what I did here. Okay, I'm going to say, a chemical common name equals, I'm going to look for 2,4-D. Okay, so now I say I want to look for 2,4-D. I want to know what the maximum residue limits for 2,4-D are, and I can pick any food commodity I want. So I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to go for crop group here, and I'm going to go for, roots and tuber vegetables. So looking at all my roots and tuber vegetables, what are the MRLs for 2,4-D? And then you click on search right here, the blue button, click search, and this is what showed up. All I have is one entry showed up, because this would say 1 of 1, it could say 1 of 10. There could be multiple results, but in this case, one result came back. And 2,4-D can be used on potatoes, and the maximum residue limit will be 0.4. Right? So this is how you can search for an MRL on any crop with any pesticide that is registered in Canada. So it's actually, I was quite intrigued with that. So if you ever want to know that, the tool's right there. You just have the MRL right here. There is the link if you're interested. Now we talk about processed food and feed. So this is where you're no longer consuming the food as it was grown. The food has now been processed. So mostly an MRL applies to what we call the raw agricultural commodity, right? So sometimes, or actually when a pesticide is sprayed on a crop, the pesticide on the crop, the residues on the crop, there's like basically one of three things it will do. Either it will degrade, it might break down into different, metabolites. It can get less, or as you're processing the food, it can concentrate. Have you taken it, for example, I got a picture of apples there. So you take apples. Okay, apples by themselves will have an MRL on for whatever with a certain pesticide. So if you eat the apple, there's an MRL based on if the apple's safe to eat or not. Now, as the apple is squished and is made into juice, apple juice itself may require a higher MRL if when it's being made into juice, the concentration of the pesticide residue increases, right? If it doesn't increase and it stays the same, then the MRL for the apple juice be the same as for the apples. So if it increases, they'll have a new one. If it stays the same, it's the same. And this is what it's like for all processed foods. And this is like for animal feed. And I'll show you this next slide here. This explains a bit better. So if you look at residues, so here is a field. There's a bunch of apple trees. There's probably something, nice. Let's call that wheat in the background there, and a nice little pathway going through it. So here is where you're spraying some pesticides. So now the food, if you go from here, it's like, apples, right? This apple can be eaten. This is our primary source of residue. It's consumed right away. So that would have to have an MRL just based on that one bit right there, because it's a primary. That's called primary residues. Now, if these apples are processed, if the field in the background is processed into animal feed, right, or further manufactured, now it's secondary. That may require a separate MRL. Now, if with this food here and with here, if it goes into your food animals, so they're munching on the hay. Okay, so if there's a beef cow here, beef cattle, right? What are the residues on the steak and the hamburger before we eat it? If it's a dairy, what are the residues in milk or cheese or any byproducts of the milk? So this is where where the pesticide goes, the residues on a pesticide that could be there. What happens when it goes through the system of the animal? Does it disappear or stay the same, or does it increase? So you look at the dietary exposure. So this is again for consuming for humans, right? So for people, I should say. So you see there's different levels of little tiny cute little guy right there. So for all populations, all geographical areas, all ethnic groups, all age groups, look into everything. So you look at say the components. So, okay, you're consuming it. So how much is being consumed? And what type of food is being consumed over a given period of time? So you look at the consumption. Oopsie, wrong way. Look at consumption, right? This is again the consumption for all of the populations. What is the result? The other part you look at are the residues. So you look at how much your person or people are eating, how much of the residue is concentrated in the food that these people are eating. We look at that. So you take the consumption and the residue, gives you dietary exposure. So this is like, it's like the form of MRLs, it's a complicated and complex procedure, and it takes a lot of knowledge, takes a lot of data, a lot of testing to set these. So we look at MRLs. Before you set a maximum residue limit, Health Canada scientists have to make sure that the amount of pesticide residues on or in food is low enough that there's no effects to human health. So I'm going to go through the steps, and just very briefly, the steps that Health Canada scientists go through before they set an MRL. The first thing they're going to do is they're going to look at acceptable daily intake and the acute reference dose. So here they are evaluating scientific studies to identify the toxicity of a pesticide. And from these studies, they determine what the no observed adverse effect levels are, and which is the level that the pesticide or the residues would cause no harm. This is in over a lifetime or in a single day, so acute and chronic, right? So looking at all of that. And when they look at this again, we said they look at all the populations, the infants, the seniors, the children, the pregnant women, the adolescents, they look at everything. The second thing they will do is they'll determine the maximum residue limits for each food commodity. So here they're determining the amount of pesticide residues left on food when the pesticide has been used according to label directions. Key thing is read the label, follow label directions, because this is the only time it applies. If you don't follow label directions, the MRLs might be totally skewed. So this they do by collecting pesticide residue data for the community commodity after it has been treated. So this is when they do the field trial studies we talked about earlier, right? Once they collect all that data, that's how they help determine what an MRL will be, because how much residue is remaining from when it was sprayed to when the crop was harvested. After that, they'll look at the estimated potential daily intake. This is the amount of a specific pesticide that a person may eat based on their diet and not come to harm. So when they look at this, they're basically looking at, or scientists, not they, the scientists are looking at, there's a variety of diets they have to look at. If you look at the amount and type of food someone in Canada could eat, that could contain certain pesticides that may be used in different foods, because apples, apple juice, apple sauce, dried apple slices, right? There's a lot of different apple things, apple pie, right? Then they will look at, they'll compare the potential daily intake to the acceptable daily intake to the acute reference dose. So it's like, again, another formula pops up, right? So when they compare the potential daily intake to the acceptable daily intake, they can determine whether they need to lower or raise the proposed MRL. Because what a person does eat, what they're expected to eat could be different. And again, it depends on the type of person. Like, I'm assuming like babies might drink more apple juice than an adult, or the other vice versa. I don't know, right? So they look at all of that. So this is what the scientists do. So this is step 1, 2, 3, and 4, right? And so the MRL levels that they propose, again, like I said before, they're based on field residue trial data. And this data has to reflect the maximum residue levels that may occur under the worst case conditions. So the maximum, the season, the maximum per season rate. So we look at the label, they're going to put the max amount they can use, the maximum amount of times they can use in a season. And they look for the minimum, the smallest amount of the pre-harvest interval. So they're looking at the most extreme cases, and then they can move themselves out. So then they look at the active ingredient, because as soon as you spray a pesticide out in the environment, the pesticide will start at some point to degrade or change or metabolize, right? So you look at the pesticide active ingredient as well as any significant metabolites. And sometimes the metabolites are more toxic than the actual active ingredient to a person, not necessarily to the crop, but to the person. So then they look at these MRLs, right? And so basically, it's just more than a pesticide. It's hard to explain, but it's hard to explain how complicated this all is, because since I don't do it myself, right? But when you look at this, the MRLs that are set in Canada, they have to be reasonable and they have to be health conscious. So they make them compatible with the MRLs established under, and I mentioned earlier, the Codex Alimentarius Commission. This is the international area. Oh, I'm running out of time. Anyway, so this is the international portion of this. So it's like, if you want to have trade, you have to be able to be flexible, but not flexible, not the right word. You have to be safer than Canada, and you have to work with the rest of the world. So it's a whole mixture of everything. So when they do the MRL setting, so the scientists, when they do their field trials, they define residues and they define a method, and they conduct the field trial. So here's a field A, B, C, D, and they get if they do it for the year, the season, they collect all the residue data, right? They review this consumer safetiness, like the MRLs that would be on there, how safe it would be for the humans, or people, I shouldn't say humans, people. And if they're finding something's unacceptable, then yoink, it has to go up and they got to try it again. So maybe they took the most extreme situation. Maybe they have to now make it a little less extreme, till they find the amount that is just perfect, right? If it's all acceptable, then their MRL is established. So it could go around in circles for a fair bit of time before they find something, they have the acceptable assessment. So now MRLs can be amended as agricultural practices change, both in Canada and internationally. If an MRL increases, it doesn't mean that human health protection decreases. Because MRLs are a function of how a pesticide is used, not a measure of how toxic or the safety of the pesticide. So you look at it like a farmer or someone's producing food, they may use pesticide in a different way. If they use it in a different way, the maximum amount of the residue that could remain on the food may change. And if they change, these changes could include applying more of a pesticide to deal with a new pest, a pesticide at different points in a growing season, like beginning, middle, end. A pesticide used differently because of changing climatic conditions could be another one. So, poll number 3, if you don't mind bringing it up, Jamie, it's a very simple, it's a yes or no question. Are MRLs a measure of pesticide toxicity or safety? Yes or no? And Jamie, can you let me know what the answers are?
Right now we're sitting at 63% that says no.
Yep, and no is the correct answer. So I am thinking I may not have time to do my international portion of this, but not to worry. That's not the part I really wasn't concerned about. So anything that the government does, we are trying to be as best we can to be open and transparent. So after scientists determine the amount of pesticide residues is low enough, there's no effects on human health, then Health Canada consults on the proposed MRLs. So when you have a consultation process, what they do is you publish a proposed maximum residue limit, consult with the public, usually it's open for like say 60 days, and then any comments that come in from the public are addressed. And if needed, the MRL value or the final decision might be adjusted. And once they've gone through the public consultation, they will legally set the MRL into a database, and they will use this MRL to monitor and protect Canadian food supply. So the MRLs can change if needed, but often they just stay as they are. Now, when you look at the consultation documents that we put out there, because they're all available on our website, they'll outline the major findings of the evaluation, the proposed maximum residue limit, and how long the consultation is open to the public. And after this is done, an MRL will be legally in effect. When they enter the new MRL or the MRL that they've established, once it goes into the database, it is now legally in effect. And after an MRL is set, it is used, as I said earlier, to monitor Canada's food supply to make sure it complies with the food and safety laws. As like I said before, CFIA does the testing for MRLs, and they do about more than 15,000 samples every year of a wide variety of foods, right? They're looking for pesticide residues. Now, the thing to note here, there's 15,000 samples. Well, that's not a whole lot because CFIA is a fairly large organization. That doesn't sound like a lot of samples, but of those 15,000 samples, each sample can include monitoring for more than 450 different pesticide residues. So this means it generates more than 6 million pesticide residue monitoring results. So it's 15,000 samples, 6 million pesticide residue monitoring results. So it sounds small-ish if you realize what they're actually looking for. They're not looking for one pesticide residue, they're looking for the gamut of them. So looking at, this is the latest information I could find, but testing in 2019, 2020, basically 99% of fruits and vegetables produced in Canada had the pesticide residues below the set maximum residue limits. And of the imported food, 94% were below. So when I looked at 2018 to 2019, the numbers were a bit lower. So it seems to be the numbers are progressing higher. So it's getting much better. So this is international cooperation. I think I've got 5 minutes left. I think I might just skip most of this portion, because basically it's just that MRLs do vary from country to country, or they might vary. If they do, it is the responsibility of the importing country to meet the expectations of the exporting company to meet the requirements of the importing country. Yeah, that's how it goes. So, and they are different, or they could be different, but they might be the same. So internationally, we work together. If you want more information on the Codex Alimentarius Commission, this was done and opened up back in 1963, and 99% of the world's population or countries are a member of this commission. If you want to know more about it, it's right there. Basically, they set MRLs, right? It's about pesticides. Bleep. So this is all the information that's in there. So this is what the MRLs for the different pesticides. This is internationally known. The host country, the terms of references are all there as well. And if you think about international trade, right, this is an important slide. So in order to facilitate trade, Canadian MRLs are aligned to the extent possible with the Codex Alimentarius and US tolerances. This helps us to import, export food products to Canada. That helps us export food products internationally. And as we know, as we look outside right now, we see all the snow falling and we hit -0 out there. We can't grow food year round unless it's in a greenhouse, right? So basically, we produce food in the summertime. We're not in the tropics, we can't produce year round. So if we can't produce food year round, that means we need to import some of our food. So if we need to import, then we need to maintain reliable access to affordable and nutritious food for all Canadians. So before we import, the country we import it from, they have to comply with the requirements for Health Canada, as do the growers within Canada. So the MRLs are the same for both. So it's not like anyone gets a leg up above the other one. So I'll just leave it at that. So minimize trade irritants, basically growers, industry, regulatory authorities. We're all a part of this. We all are involved in trying to minimize trade irritants, meaning we want to import, we want to export. This is the last slide here, if food products contain residues exceeding limits, enforcement actions may be taken. I mentioned this earlier. Here's some of the things that the CFIA, Canadian Food Inspection Agency, could do if they're finding MRLs in a crop that's higher or an import of food that's higher than it is allowed to be. And here is a slide. This is just like, I'm in a part of the Prairie region, but this is just the Alberta contacts. If you have any questions based on pesticides, you can call, email, text any one of us in Alberta. And thank you so much for listening. I have 1 minute to spare, which is not great.
No, thanks, Andrea, for your presentation. Fascinating as always. I appreciate your knowledge and expertise, so thanks for sharing it with us. There is a couple questions, so we'll just quickly see if we can get them answered. Is Health Canada considering how selective spray technology will impact how they set MRLs into the future?
That is a very good answer. Good question. And I'd like to say yes. I really would like to say yes. I'll just say yes. It's hard because it takes a long time to set up all these trials and to get, let me just stop sharing here so I don't get myself distracted. And close it out. Every time something changes, like it requires, like you saw when I said, like, there's proposed maximum residue levels. So every time they propose something, if something has to change, then they have to vet it, public information or public opinions, and then they send it back, right? So the simple answer is yes, but it's not as quick as growers would like it to be, because it's a decision that can't be made quickly or lightly. It has to be made scientifically, And therefore we need research, we need trials, we need information. And to do that, it takes time. Hopefully that answers that question.
I'm sure it does. Another question, do you see MRLs increase in concentration or decrease in concentration in grass or barley after it's gone through cattle and into steak?
I don't know. That's a very, very, very cool question. To answer that question, I would have to go to the MRLs on our website, and I would have to look up MRLs on steak and MRLs on barley/wheat and see if they're the same or different. If they're the same, then it wouldn't increase going through. If there's a difference, then there was a concentration, or the residues did concentrate going through. So I know some pesticides, when they go through I think clopyralid, when it goes through the cattle and comes out and goes for composting, it doesn't change at all. So that one, I can answer that question, but I have to do some research first.
Fair enough. I think Daniel's just saying it's close to lunch, so we started thinking about
food. It is. I know.
There is one more question. I don't know if you can answer it or not, but how far away are approvals of pesticides for drone applications?
Well, right now there actually are 3, but they're all larvicides, so they may not be of any use to anyone. This is where the province comes in as well, because there might be products registered. There are things being, if there's research trials going on for different companies using drones to apply different products. I know there's a herbicide coming down the chain at some point, but they're right now in the research trial phase. So once they go through the research trial phase, then they can determine how much or how the drone can apply pesticides, where they can apply it, how much they can apply, and the rates they can apply it at, and then they can add it to the label, that they being the companies that register products. And then they can approach the PMRA and send it in for a change or an addition to a label, like make a label amendment or something like that. But that's the one part. The other part is the province is putting together manual so that you have, like, it's going to become a standalone certificate. So ground applicator, agriculture applicator, greenhouse, aerial, they have different certificates. There'll be one specific for drones. And that module, they're hoping to have it out by May of this year. So even if there were registered products for drones in Alberta right now, we still couldn't use them because no one's in Alberta licensed yet to apply pesticides by drones. That's a very convoluted answer, but does that help at all?
Yes, I'm sure it does. All right, I will stop sharing.